I used to own a Royal Enfield Interceptor 650. I tried turning it into a scrambler, as you'll see in this video from a few years ago. And I loved that bike. I used it for everything: Sunday blasts, long tours, and even off-road that it was not made for. It was a compromise for sure, and the bike wasn't without problems, but I loved it. But after a couple of years, after experiencing on one hand harder off-road and on the other hand a track day, I decided that I wanted more of everything. So I replaced my Interceptor not with one, but 3 bikes. An MT-07 for the road and track, a Himalayan 450 for adventure touring, and a Honda CRF 150L for off-road. But pretty much right after I had finished this whole bike transition, Royal Enfield suddenly announced the Bear 650. Basically, a factory-built Interceptor Scrambler. Damn! This, I thought, was the bike I had wanted all along. An Interceptor with more suspension travel, switchable ABS, and even a torque boost. And on top of all that, the right looks. Here was a more affordable bike that, in my opinion, could compete aesthetically and in fit and finish with European scramblers, but without the quirks and preciousness of European bikes. And so since then, the Bear 650 became this lingering what if for me. Well, now a year later, I've finally ridden a Bear 650 press bike from Royal Enfield Philippines. I rode it just under 1,000 kilometers in various conditions, on and off road. And I thought I knew what I was getting before riding it, but it still managed to surprise me. And let me tell you why. My name is Aaron Palabiab, and this is the Ride XP review of the Royal Enfield Interceptor Bear 650. As always, I like to open with the gist. The Royal Enfield Bear 650 is, I believe, the brand's most widely desirable bike. A versatile lifestyle machine with a charming engine at a relatively accessible price. What it lacks in performance, it makes up for in charisma. It grabs attention, but in true Royal Enfield fashion, doesn't have a haughty aura. Its principal flaw is the stiff rear shocks, by far, followed by the height and weight, and finally the lack of pillion comfort. The Bear has none of the comfort and plushness of a true modern adventure bike, but chances are, if you ride one, if you like this style of bike, it'll charm you enough that it'll make you want to really embrace that scrambler lifestyle from the coffee shop to the mountains. All in all, I think Royal Enfield have taken this kind of midlife platform and made a truly aspirational bike that more of us can actually own. So I've ridden a number of small to middleweight retro bikes in the past year, and I found the Bear to be uniquely inspiring among them. It just made me want to keep finding opportunities to shoot it and on it, as you'll see in my recent vlogs, which you should watch after this review. So with that, let's dive into the details. So first, we'll go in detail on the specs and my impression of these individual components. And then I'll talk about how that all adds up to how the bike feels and performs in different situations. And then finally, we'll round out the long discussion by talking about the Bear versus the competition. So let's start with the motor. The Bear 650's engine is that familiar air-cooled 650cc 270-degree parallel twin. It pumps out 47 horsepower at 7,250 RPM and 56.5 Newton meters of torque at 5,150 RPM, which is 8% more peak torque than the Interceptor. It sounds great, and the extra punch from the torque bump is noticeable and welcome. For the suspension, you now get a full Showa setup. At the front, you get thicker, upside-down 43mm Showa big piston separate function forks. That's a mouthful. So these forks have 130 millimeters travel, which is up from 110 millimeters conventional forks with 41 millimeters travel on the Interceptor. At the rear, you get twin shocks with 115 millimeters travel that are only adjustable for preload. And that's up from a mere 88 millimeters on the Interceptor. So for better or for worse, everything you've heard and read about this suspension is true. It's sporty, firm, and great on the street. The forks perform pretty well and they resist bottoming out on jumps, according to my friends. But the shocks are sprung heavily and lack damping adjustment, making it bone-jarring for riders below about 90 kilos. So I think the shocks would certainly be the first thing to be replaced if I were to buy a Bear 650. Moving up to the dash, instead of the twin clocks you get on the original 650s, you now get the round digital TFT tripper dash first seen on the Himalayan 450. It also supports direct phone pairing for map display right on the dash, but like many, I never used it because it doesn't work with the phone screen off. But what I do appreciate is that finally you get an Interceptor with a gear indicator. Moving on to the lights, this is now the first Royal Enfield 650 to feature all LED lighting. The headlight is bright and it turns with the bar. Turn signals and tail light are all new, again all LED, and you also get a hazard light switch. Talking about the chassis, it has a revised rear subframe to accommodate that longer rear suspension. You will notice that the rear loop on the bike is kicked up as a result. So it has a longer wheelbase and a slacker rake. The front fork and axle have also been stiffened, which improves front end feel and braking. Wet weight is 215 or 216 kilos, depending on your source. That's 474 pounds, and that's marginally lighter than the 218 kilos of the original Interceptor. But still, regardless, that weight is carried low, noticeably lower than the Himalayan 450. Of course, the trade-off for more suspension travel is a bump in seat height, which is now pretty much the same as the Himalayan 450 at 830 millimeters. Honestly, combined with the bike's weight, that height was at about the limit of what I'd find easy to deal with at my height of 169 centimeters or almost 5'7". There were definitely one or two moments when I thought I was gonna drop the bike because of that extra height. But the good thing is, despite all of that, the bike will shock you with how lightly it handles. More on that later. Moving down, instead of the 18-inch wheels you get on the Interceptor, you now get the standard Scrambler setup with a 19-inch front and a 17-inch rear, spoked with inner tubes. The tires are MRF copies of the Pirelli Scorpion Rally STRs, and basically they exceeded my expectations. They gave predictable, reliable traction. They weren't a limiting factor for me, even in the wet. I've heard other reviewers call them a bit vague, like not giving you a good idea of the amount of grip. Maybe it's true, but after a while, you just realize that you can count on them for good grip. Speaking of grip, the footpegs have been changed and inherited from the Himalayan 450, and it's a big improvement. They're bigger, wider, grippier, and you can finally take the rubber inserts out for more purchase when standing. This, for me, was one of the biggest annoyances of using my old Interceptor off-road. It had those skinny foot pegs that just had no grip when they were even slightly damp. The shifter and brake lever also look like adjusted versions of the same components from the Himalayan 450. Position-wise, they still kind of dig into your shins like they always did on the Interceptor, but that's just if you're not used to putting your feet ahead slightly forward at a stop. For me, it was an easy adjustment, but it does bother some people. For brakes, you get a 320mm disc up front and a 270mm disc at the rear, both with ABS, and the rear ABS is now switchable for off-road use with a single dedicated button press. Braking performance and feel is good and noticeably better for me than on the Interceptor. For your exhaust, you now get a 2-into-1 exhaust instead of the twin chrome pipes, and I do prefer this for what I do because, well, it's lighter and there's less chance of burning your boots, your bags, and yourself. As a result, it also has its own unique sound among the 650s, being the only single pipe of the 650s. And in stock form on short rides, well, it's a little bit too quiet, but on long tours, I found the volume to be just right. And I also prefer kind of this standard height exhaust to a high scrambler exhaust, which looks cool, but it does increase heat on the legs. It moves up the center of gravity and also makes carrying bags a little more complicated. This kind of more normal position for me is less aesthetic, but more practical. Moving back up to the handlebars, you get these higher and wider handlebars that encourage a more elbows up position. Ergos were just right for me, seated or standing for my height. It's still slightly forward in keeping with this being mainly a road bike, but all of that really depends on how tall you are. When you stand up, the main thing that really helps is the new Footpegs, because you can just really kind of stay very secure on the bike, and the height of the handlebars was good for me. Moving to the grips, you get the big adjustable levers from the Super Meteor and the updated switchgear, all of which have a pretty good fit and finish and are definitely an upgrade over that first generation of 650s. But on the flip side, you also get the same flimsy and finicky joystick from the Himalayan 450 to navigate the TFT dash menus. And finally, there's a USB-C 5V 2A charging port in there as well. Talking about fuel economy, my average for the time I spent with the bike, that included stretches of wide open throttle, was 24.6 kilometers per liter. That's about 4 liters per 100 kilometers or 58 US miles per gallon. You can get significantly more with a light hand, in my experience up to about 29 kilometers per liter as well. So with my usage with a 13.7 liter fuel tank, that adds up to just over 330 kilometers or just over 200 miles. For me, I've always just fueled up at around 230 to 240 kilometers on the trip meter. Onto the seat, you get a scrambler style one-piece bench, firmish with a useful grab strap for moving the bike around. Comfort on this seems to depend a lot on the individual rider. I personally find a slightly firm seat to be the most comfortable on longer rides. I've ridden softer seats that left me more numb over long distances than this one. And I think there's just something about a moderately firm seat, and I guess depending on your weight as well, but a moderately firm seat engages your glutes or something, and that explains why it aches less after a while. I'm just about 60 plus kilos without too much butt padding, so your experience will really vary. But personally, I liked it. Below the seat, you have the side panel with the integrated racing number board, and underneath that conceals a compact toolkit. Moving down, the Bear doesn't get a bash plate stock, although the double cradle frame does give you some engine protection. But best of all, to my relief, is that the regulator rectifier is no longer on the underbelly of the bike, but has been relocated to the front of the chassis. The old 650s were notorious for RR failures, and replacing and relocating them was a difficult, costly, and specialized job. So kudos to RE for solving that main problem of the 650s. Anyway, I think that covers going over the specs and everything on the bike. So now we can talk about how this all adds up in the different aspects of the overall ride XP. Starting with, frankly, the first thing you notice, and for me, the main draw, which is the looks. I think Royal Enfield has knocked it out of the park with the colorways on the Bear 650, especially this Wild Honey variant that I'm using, and the top spec 249 variant with its distinctive teal frame. Also, with the increased seat height from 804 to 830 millimeters, I think the bike gains a presence that the Interceptor didn't have. And I speak from experience because my Interceptor would sometimes be mistaken for a small bike and be accosted for trying to enter the expressway, especially if a tall rider was on it. But looks would be empty without real heart, which is that engine. This 650 twin remains one of my favorites. It's torquey and smooth, just a joy for cruising. Riding this bike all day honestly feels so good, with this pleasant, satisfying burble that feels great under your legs. I'd describe it as effortless to use in almost any situation except going very fast. RPMs are low on the highway and there's minimal vibrations within the normal rev range that you would ride in. It climbs hills easily in third gear, so you never feel like you're working that engine too hard. Now, I wouldn't describe the Bear 650 as fast, but it is lively. You can cruise easily all day, but still open up and have some fun or overtake with ease when you want to. Top speed is nothing impressive, it's just over 160, so you're not gonna keep up with guys on XSR 700s or Ducati Scramblers, which are in the 70 plus horsepower range, but that's not what this bike is for. When I did try to ride it hard to keep up with fast friends on fast bikes, I could feel immediately that this was outside the bike's intended parameters. At that moment, it felt like the bike lost its best qualities. It suddenly felt jittery, the brakes felt weak, and I started hitting false neutrals. Of course, this was also down to my technique falling apart a bit when pushing hard, so your experience may vary. The torque bump does help, but don't expect a total transformation. If you're a speed freak or need a bike to double as a track weapon, this might not be it. That said, there's still plenty of fun to be had if you engage with it as intended. In the twisties, the handling is on point. As another reviewer said, it's planted, playful, and predictable. It responds quickly to footpeg inputs and feels perfectly balanced. I also noticed it has better chassis feel and stability than the Interceptor. All in all, for me, the combination of looks, engine, and handling already make this bike painfully close to a home run in this category, with the rear shock being the biggest knock against it. But it's just so nice and easy to ride and so nice to look at when you step off of it, and I think for many of us that's really all we want out of a motorcycle. But fine, there are many more things to want on a motorcycle, so moving on, let's discuss touring and comfort. There is no getting around how stiff that rear shock is, even with the minimum amount of preload. So if you're a lighter rider, you're never finding that sweet spot on the stock shocks with the stock springs. I did try maxing out the preload, that hack suggested by Sagar Sheldakar, but it just made everything worse for me. It made the bike both stiffer and a lot taller. All of which is why it surprised me that I felt comfortable on it on my long 1,000-kilometer tour. I still felt fresh after 2 whole days of riding, despite the heat and wearing a backpack with a duffel at the back. And I only started to feel tired on the 3rd day of riding. As I said, I prefer slightly firm seats, and I don't know if maybe the extra weight of my duffel behind me also helped the shocks to perform better. But honestly, for any stretches of rough terrain where plushness would have been needed, I always just stood up to avoid the problem like any good ADV nerd. Wind protection is absent, but I'm used to it. I find it manageable as long as I'm not speeding, which I don't, especially on this bike. Now, when it comes to attaching luggage, the Bear 650 has extra grab handles that make luggage mounting easier than your average naked bike, so that's a good quality of life upgrade. Just note that it's hard to strap on a non-magnetic tank bag because of the shape of that side number plate getting in the way of the straps. In my trip, I had a 50-liter Trip Machine Outlaw duffel on the back, and I still had enough space to be comfortable on the bike with that behind me and wearing a backpack. In contrast to when I did the same thing on the Ducati Scrambler, full throttle. The Ducati, FYI, had no rear grab rails, so the big duffel was constantly pressing on my back the whole ride, which ended up honestly being pretty painful after just half a day. No such issue with the Bear, but it also depends on how big you are and how big your bags are. That single-sided coated exhaust also gives more freedom to mount saddlebags compared to the dual chrome pipes of the Interceptor, which were notorious for burning bags and boots alike, especially of your Pillion. Which reminds me, is this bike comfortable for a Pillion? No. Sorry, I mean, the Interceptor wasn't, and on that bike I had to use a footpeg relocator kit so that my 5'9" ex-girlfriend could ride comfortably. The Bear, despite the new exhaust, suffers from the same thing. There's just not much room back there, so I don't really see this as a 2-up bike unless your passenger is rather petite. if you need a lot of room for luggage and a pillion, you need a proper adventure bike, not this. But the Bear 650 has just enough space and mounting points to do the job decently for a solo rider. And it does it while looking a lot less nerdy, than an adventure bike, which counts for a lot for some people, including myself. And now the moment many of you have been waiting for, off-road performance. You should know, again, if you're new to this channel, that I'm an average off-road rider. So if you want to see how much the Bear can bear on the dirt, go check out On the Back Wheel, Mad TV, and Free Miles MC. My takeaway from them riding the Bear 650 at the limit off-road is that, well, like any bike, the Bear 650 can do amazing things off-road if the rider is skilled and willing enough. But there's zero doubt that this is a road bike. But still, let's discuss its supposed off-road credentials. Well, first thing I noticed, the Bear 650 has switchable ABS, which for the longest time I actually wished I could get on my Interceptor. But now, with hindsight and more experience, I've realized that switchable ABS isn't the game changer I imagined it would be. It's more of a fun add-on than a true performance upgrade on a bike like this. I mean, okay, it's cool if you want to be able to do brake slides and just have maximum control off-road if you're really an off-road guy. But in my humble opinion, any trail that would require switching off the ABS to get through properly wouldn't be a trail that this bike is designed to tackle. To be honest, and you are very welcome to disagree with me because I'm not an off-road expert, I don't think any of the Scrambler upgrades, even the 19-inch front, the longer suspension, the slightly higher ground clearance, I don't think any of those actually make it truly appreciably better off-road than the Interceptor was for most people. The tires maybe do a bit better on dry dirt than Interceptor's road tires, but the rest, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. But I think most of us won't be tackling anything hard enough for the extra clearance to matter. For example, it's still only like 184 millimeters or 7.2 inches. And we already know that the longer suspension hasn't increased compliance. And the front end, I've found it gets nervous fast. And that's not even talking about the rear shock. Come to think of it, after using the Bear 650, for me, the best dirt-oriented mods on the Bear aren't any of the things on the brochure. Not the ABS, the suspension, the ground clearance, or the tires or tire size. It is actually the foot pegs that can keep your feet on the pegs while you're standing. And it's also blacking out all of the chrome parts so you don't have to worry about keeping them shiny. Moreover, again with hindsight, for me it actually loses two things that allowed me to ride stupid off-road things on my old Interceptor. That is a low seat height and being very cheap. And I'm not hating on the Bear at all for any of this. This is actually me admitting to myself, after all the time I spent modifying my ex-bike, that the true performance gains were marginal at best for my height, riding style, and skill level. I mean, maybe it's just that I've grown up enough in motorcycling to accept that in the age of the adventure bike, scramblers are truly more aesthetic than functional. But on the other hand, that's precisely the point, isn't it? The point, the value, is the psychological impact of knowing the bike you have has been made and marketed as a rugged gentleman's adventurer. And to be fair, on packed dirt, anything easy, this bike is a hoot. And it makes you feel like a movie star when you see the photos. The engine is also really great off-road because it has so much low-down torque and it's so smooth and tractable. I mean, fine, the Bear 650 is conclusively not a capital A adventure bike. It doesn't feel like one at all. But at the same time, you would be hard-pressed to find an adventure bike that is as widely appealing outside the ADV niche as the Bear 650. And that's what I have to say about off-road. Moving on to the other side of the spectrum, let's talk about commuting. What the Bear 650 has going for it in this department is, first, excellent heat management. I rode this bike in very heavy Manila traffic, in hot sun, and in heavy rain, and I never noticed the engine heat. Its second asset in traffic is that engine, which is, as I said, so easy to use. You can even take off in second gear if you want, so it's easy to use the bike without stalling. Turning radius is pretty good, and the bike again handles really easily. And that single-sided pipe also helps when it comes to filtering compared to the double pipes of the Interceptor. And I rode this bike unwillingly, but I had to. I rode it a lot in torrential rain, and I found the bike very manageable even in those conditions. I really never felt at risk of the bike getting away from me, even going downhill on a twisty road. The main cons for me in the commuting aspect are definitely, of course, the tall and wide handlebar, which might make it hard to squeeze in tight spaces in filtering, and then, of course, the tall seat height for obvious reasons. And finally, of course, the size and the weight. And because of that increased seat height, it also leans over a lot on the side stand like its brother, the Himi 450. So basically, when you're parking it, you always have to give extra clearance to the left to avoid hitting or blocking vehicles. And of course, it makes it a little heavier when you're trying to push the bike upright. But that said, the Bear 650 is surprisingly manageable to push around in the garage compared to even the lighter Himalayan 450 because it is still less top-heavy than any proper adventure bike. Now for the clutch feel, it's on the heavy side to be honest, but it's perfectly manageable. But also, I found that even adjusted to the lowest setting, the biting point on the clutch was high for my decently sized hands. But in the end, I also got used to it. And finally, it does have a slipper clutch, which is welcome. It's something you notice immediately when you don't have it, like on my XSR 700, where downshifts or wrong downshifts can sometimes feel pretty sketchy. Moving on, next topic, what about reliability? Well, the 650s generally have a good reputation. But if you watch my video on why I sold my Interceptor, you'll know that I had a bunch of problems with mine at about 20,000 kilometers. But at least they already fixed the most consistent point of failure, which was that regulator rectifier. Again, it's been relocated and it should be fine now. So in terms of the problems I had, that leaves the gearbox, the electricals, the brake master cylinder, and the steering head bearings as basically the things I'd watch out for based on my own previous experience. Now, if you've already experienced these problems on the Bear, let me know in the comments below. What bugged me most while I was using the Bear 650 was that it still tended to miss shifts when riding hard, like every Interceptor and GT 650 I have ever used. Now, I mean, maybe that's just a lack of coordination on my part, but it's my experience. Honestly, I'm not a mechanically inclined person. I just need a bike to work with as little drama as possible. So I suppose the most sensible thing that I can say from my experience is that the Bear 650, like all new Royal Enfields, should largely not give you any big, expensive, time-consuming headaches. But they're certainly not yet at the level of Japanese bikes. Because I've owned two Yamaha CP2 bikes now over the course of over a year. And these bikes require so little attention to run seemingly perfectly. Whereas with my Interceptor, there was always some niggle. Very few, but still some of which eventually became big. Like losing my front brake, as you'll see in this video. But then, to be fair, that's the experience of one guy who was the third owner of an Interceptor who took it to some really dirty places. I've honestly heard and read very little that tells me these bikes can't largely be counted on. But if you do have experience, let me know in the comments because we would all benefit from that. Now, if I did own a Bear 650, what accessories or mods would I prioritize? Obviously, I would start with swapping out the rear shock. That's not cheap, but it's what you need to get the best out of this bike. Next, maybe handguards, both for the look and to protect it from the occasional spill, which is inevitable if you like to scramble. Then a sump guard, because now that the rectifier has been relocated, it won't be a problem to have a sump guard down there. I'd also look into uncorking that pipe. It's too quiet. And then finally, I would swap out the stock mirrors for double-take scrambler mirrors like I had on my Interceptor, or get the RE folding touring mirrors. Moving on, now I'm not a nitpicker by nature, but you're watching this to get detailed information, so nitpick I shall. First, you no longer get a center stand unlike most Royal Enfields, and that was pretty handy to have on the Interceptor, but I guess the increased height meant they couldn't bring that over from the old bike. Second, there's just no getting around that weight. The low center of gravity really helps, but 215 kilos is still a lot considering you have other bikes in the category, or well, like slightly lower, that are like under 190 kilos. Next, I already mentioned the side stand lean. And yeah, those mirrors, the stock mirrors, they look all right, but they get too vibey once you start pushing on the highway. There's also the fact that this bike still comes with tubed tires. Tubeless spokes would have been great, considering they already offer that on the Himalayan 450, or just the option for tubeless rims like you get with some of the new 650s. I've also already mentioned the heavy clutch, but this leads to kind of my main nitpick, which are the positions of the shifter and the rear brake. The shifter, compared to pretty much every other bike I've ridden, is at this weird position which is angled more sharply outward, I think to avoid the bulge of the engine. I don't know why it's different from the Interceptor, but the result is that the lever tends to hit the middle of your foot instead of like the knuckle of your big toe, and it actually hurts. You do get used to it. It's not a deal breaker, but basically you have to ride with your toe pointing out or else it hurts a little bit. Next is the position of the rear brake. In this case, the angle is fine, but when you put the balls of your foot on the peg, there's just not much room for your heel. So this time, it's kind of the opposite, where instead of your toe pointing outward, you have to have your heel pointing outward and your toe inward, which is a little bit uncomfortable. Of course, this isn't an issue when you're using the rear brake and your heel is on the foot peg. But when you're not, when you have the balls of your feet on the foot peg, it just feels a little cramped and unnatural. Again, not a deal breaker, but certainly noticeable enough to bring up. And honestly, that's about it for my complaints. Other people also don't seem to like the 1917 tire size because it reduces tire choices. And, well, finally, the taller seat height. This may kind of eliminate the bike as a beginner option for riders 5'6" and below. Short beginner riders are definitely better off choosing the Interceptor or one of the many lighter bikes in this category, which I will mention shortly. Basically, I think that they would struggle with this bike in traffic because of the height and weight. So let's wrap up the main discussion by talking about the competition, starting with, I think, its #1 competition, the original Interceptor 650. So compared to the original Interceptor, the Bear is more expensive, especially considering how cheap used Interceptors are on the secondhand market. But at the same time, the Bear offers a lot of value because it doesn't need all of the Scrambler mods, and it has unique colors and all of that. Comparing living with the two, I think the Bear wins with better foot pegs, a more comprehensive digital dash with a gear indicator, and there's no chrome, so it's easier to care for. Again, it has more torque and smoother power delivery, better handling, better brakes, and maybe better tires. But on the other hand, the Interceptor wins with a lower seat height and more authentically classic looks. And honestly, as I said, it's not drastically far behind in the off-road department either. For me, if you're short, I really think the Interceptor is still a better choice. If you buy a used one, then you'll still have money left over to modify and customize it as you like. Personally though, I would pick the Bear 10 out of 10 times. Next up, I actually want to mention the discontinued Royal Enfield Scram 411. The Scram 411 has always been an underrated bike. It's possibly the most off-road capable scrambler, being based on a real adventure bike, and yet it still feels great on the road. It's just that the Scram's agrarian engine and build might be lacking for many in this day and age. I don't know about the Scram 440 because it doesn't seem to be coming out here and many other markets. Correct me if I'm wrong. The Scram also doesn't have switchable ABS, if that matters to you. Now, how about the very, very intriguing Triumph Scrambler 400X? Now, that's an interesting comparison, because the 400X is very light and very skinny and has a nice engine that punches above its weight. I would choose the Triumph if I were buying a scrambler to be ridden off-road a lot, because it just takes so much less energy to throw around and pick up, being so light. But for me, the 400X, though a cute and very fun bike, loses out to the Bear for looks and overall character. The 650 Twin is also a nicer engine to use than this kind of KTM-like single cylinder on the Triumph. Another bike that I would compare in almost exactly the same terms as the 400X would be the Svart 401. Now, I haven't ridden the new Svart, but based on what I know, it offers similar value for money in terms of its feature set and electronics package as the Scrambler 400X. And you also get a really lightweight, now in a distinctly retro future style. I found the original Svart to be a great bike on the road, being a KTM, but way too stiff for riding a lot off-road. But again, with it being so light, the Svart can do crazy things off-road. Just look at the videos of my buddy Stavro. As to how it compares with the Bear, again, just repeat what I said about the Triumph 400X. Now, moving up a bit, what about the new Fantic Caballero 500? This is like the Scrambler 400X on crack. It's more powerful, has better components, arguably better looks, and potentially legit adventure bike capability with options for either 21 or 19-inch front wheel. All at a really good price that's just a hop and skip above the Bear 650s. Now, I briefly test rode the 21-inch front rally version off-road and came away extremely impressed with the combination of lightweight, premium feel, and ADV bike-like specs. The Caballero, to me, feels the closest to being a unicorn among the middleweight scramblers. But it's a new bike with a new engine from an Italian brand, so that always raises questions, right? But to be honest, this is a bike that I'm rooting for and really want. It checks so many boxes. But where the Bear still wins for me is the same, just that authentic scrambler aesthetic and engine character. Then we have some honorable mentions that I'm not really interested in, but you might ask about, so I'll mention them, which are mainly the Honda CL 500, Bristol Veloce 500, and even the CF Moto CLX 700. Now, I lump these together because I don't think any of these bikes can really touch the Bear 650 if you're talking about looks, appeal, charisma. These bikes, for me, don't offer anything that's interesting enough to overlook that shortcoming, unlike the previous bikes I mentioned. The CL 500 offers the most reliability, being that Honda 500cc engine, and also offers a bit of a lighter weight, but it just aesthetically is such a miss for me. It looks really plain, and it's not the most exciting engine. The Bristol Veloce, I don't like how it looks, feels, or rides, but it's definitely good value, and it's proven itself off-road in this country. The CLX is more powerful, it's also great value, but it's heavy, and neither the engine nor the design really speak to me. Now, let's move up and look at more premium competition, because this is where it gets really interesting. Because for me, the Bear 650 has reached a level of quality and design where it would compare favorably with the much more expensive Triumph Scrambler 900. And not just because it's cheaper. The Scrambler 900 for me is actually the best looking neo-retro motorcycle in the market. And you pay accordingly. It's close to twice the price of the Bear 650 in this country. And honestly, I know it's a great bike, but I've never really gotten along with the Scrambler 900. I don't like how it handles. I don't get along with the gears. I find it really heavy and I find it really hot. That's just me though. Your experience may vary. So for my money, the Bear 650 is just lighter, cheaper to own, handles a lot better, and I dare say a bit more hip. And also, I feel a lot less anxious taking the Bear off-road than the Scrambler 900. How about the Ducati Scrambler? I had one on loan for a while and I loved it. The Ducati is much lighter than the Bear 650, has a smooth, powerful engine, and pretty good suspension. It is actually, because of all of those things, competent off-road. You could reasonably save just a little longer and buy the entry-level Ducati instead of the Bear 650 and get a far superior riding experience both on and off-road. But well, a Ducati is a Ducati. That means, for one, borderline intolerable engine heat during the summer. Though only during the summer, at least in my experience, for the new generation Scrambler. And everything is just more expensive. You've got your Desmo service, and replacing any parts you happen to break while you're doing stupid things off-road is a lot more expensive. So just the affordability of the Bear gives it kind of this default edge for anyone who wants to live that Scrambler lifestyle, and it's a lot more livable in a hot country like the Philippines. Between the two, in terms of looks, it really depends on your taste. And at this point, I want to point out that I think that Yamaha, by not making a factory Scrambler version of their XSR 700, is just missing out, because I think that would be the killer bike in this category. Basically, a short man's T7 for what should be a cheaper price. So Yamaha, you're probably not watching, but in case you are, please, XSR 700 Scrambler, think about it. But how does it compare to the Himalayan 450? Because I've heard people asking this question. How do they compare basically as your one bike to do it all? I mean, after all, the Himalayan 450 has still got a round headlight, so you still get a bit of that retro vibe. And the two bikes are actually just 5 millimeters apart in seat height, with the Bear being the taller of the two. And their power figures are also really close. In real-world use, the Bear only feels slightly faster than the Hemi. It's just not working as hard to do it. But to answer your question, the Hemi 450 and the Bear 650 feel basically nothing alike. The Hemi looks and rides like a small adventure bike. It's top-heavy, but it's plush. It's a purpose-built mile muncher that can double as your hardcore off-roader if you want it to. In contrast, the Bear 650 again is more lifestyle than travel bike. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. So if you had to choose between these two, I'd say choose the Hemi if you need proper adventure touring capability. And choose the Bear if you want a charismatic cafe bike that is equally happy to be a Sunday cruiser, a playful roadster, a countryside tourer, and soft roader. Whew, okay, this video has gotten really long, so let's take it home. Should you buy a Bear 650? Would I buy a Bear 650? Let me put it this way. I sold my Himalayan 411 for an Interceptor because I didn't need the off-road performance of the Hemi after all. Recently, I've realized that I lack the skills and more so the determination to regularly ride big bikes off-road. So, it was tempting to swap, once again, my Hemi 450 for the Bear 650 for pretty much exactly the same reasons as I had done before. In fact, my realization about scramblers and why they matter so much to me is that all the adventure bikes with the middleweight engines that I really like are too big for my height and skill level. That's basically the T7, the Aprilia Touareg, the V-Strom 800, the Transalp, and even maybe the Norden. So scramblers are how I can get those engines in a bike that's a size and weight that I feel confident on while maintaining a semblance of off-road ability. Scramblers are the bikes that fit my lifestyle the best. And in that regard, the Bear 650 is, flaws and all, a lovable and inspiring machine that I can easily recommend to anyone who wants to live that scrambler lifestyle. You know what's happened here? It's like my ex-bike came back sexier, and she fixed some of the problems that led to us breaking up. And then we spent time together again, and all those old feelings came back, and it just felt right. Which begs the question, is it time to get back together? I think I know the answer you want to hear, and I did give it serious consideration. But the truth is that, well, first of all, circumstances have conspired to make me replace my Hemi 450 with an even bigger bike, which I posted about in my second to the last video. But that aside, and more relevant for this discussion, is that I'm already with someone else, and she makes me happy. My Yamaha XSR 700, she also looks good and sounds pretty awesome. And she's both more reliable and more exciting than the Bear, though significantly harder to control. And she's also proven herself off-road, but not by me. So in the end, I'm just happily committed to my Japanese bike for the foreseeable future. And I lack the willingness to add an overlapping bike to my stable. Doesn't mean I don't love the Bear, I really do. It's just that not all love is meant to be pursued. At least not right now. Whew, and that's it. Thanks for sticking with this one. I know the wait was long and the video was even longer. But I hope I made it worth your while by basically emptying my whole brain into this review. If it was helpful, do leave a like, comment for the algorithm, subscribe, all those nice things, and I will see you on the next adventure. Mwah.